Those were my biggest mistakes. Back then, I could not see that. It took me years to learn that lesson. Do whatever you want, but test the waters, test yourself first. So I think when you study your story with that in mind, you move away a little bit from your ego, from your necessity to talk about yourself, and you start putting the listener or the reader in the center of that moment. My bank account had dropped dramatically in the process. And then there was again starting life from square one more time.
Hey there, real quick, if you enjoyed the show, please support by following on your favorite podcast station, review and share it with your peers to help them and me out, because I don't run any ads and every share helps. Thanks, and let's jump into it. Hey Savio, welcome to the show.
Hello Gabe, how you doing, man?
Pretty good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's 7 a.m. here in Portugal now, and starting off my day on the right foot talking to you for your podcast. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much for joining so early, and I say hi to you from the future, from Bali, where we are in the afternoon already, 2 p.m. And really excited about this conversation. Can you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure, absolutely. Look, my name is Savio, as you guys already know by now. I am originally from Brazil. I was born in a city called Fortaleza, in the northeast coast of Brazil. And like any other Brazilian kid, I grew up in the streets playing football, flying kites as well. Fortaleza is a huge city. It has about 3 million inhabitants, and I lived in one of the least privileged areas, let's put it this way. So lots of crime, lots of social problems happening, but at the same time, I grew up in a household with school teachers. Both of my parents were school teachers. So I grew up in that environment, also inside of a small community school, which they owned at the time. And yeah, that's pretty much my background back in Brazil as a kid, as a teenager. Later on in life, I joined the army by the age of 19, if I'm not mistaken. Spent about 1.5 years in the army, which was good, in my view at least, from a resilience perspective and teamwork and learning how to work as a team and how to perform tasks under pressure. After the army, I entered my professional life, my civilian professional life, if you like, and worked as a travel agent for a number of years. Also had a few businesses on the side with my cousins. I think it's quite a normal thing back in Brazil to get together with friends or cousins and set up businesses. And that's my background story back in Brazil. I usually say my previous life because by the age of 26, I decided that I wanted to leave Brazil and experience life in a different country, in a different place, learn new languages and experience new cultures. At the time, I wasn't necessarily happy with my life back in Brazil. I owned a small travel agency, had a car, had a girlfriend. Life was, at least from the perspective of people, society, life was great. But in my opinion, back then, life wasn't that great. I wasn't feeling fulfilled. I wasn't feeling happy. Something was wrong, and I didn't really know what it was. But part of the answer to that existential problem was, to me, leaving the place where I grew up and going to another place to experience life in a different way, change my lifestyle, shake things off a little bit. And that's what I did. So I went to New Zealand, then Australia, then Southeast Asia, Europe a few times. And that's in a span of 10 to 12 years. I'm kind of speeding things up a little bit here to get to where I am today, which is in Portugal. Just moved here about a year ago after living in Australia for almost a decade. So that's the overall background of my story.
How that background influence your life and your career?
Every time I look back and think about my childhood in Brazil, it makes me reflect about where I am today and what's the connection to those times. And I have a feeling that having parents who were school teachers and my father also being a writer helped me to develop an appreciation for books and stories back then. And I only had that realization a few months ago. I was thinking about life in Brazil, but yeah, my father, he's a writer. Besides having been also a teacher, and that influenced me in a very positive way, I would say. I always loved writing back in school. Writing was actually one of the few disciplines that I did well in school. Most of the other disciplines, I wasn't necessarily a great student, but writing, yeah, Portuguese and writing and literature, those are the disciplines that I had a tendency to like and to do well back in school. But I also had some of my family members, some of my relatives, they were all great storytellers. Some of my uncles back in the countryside of Brazil, I remember going there for holidays every July and also December, and spending hours just listening to one of my uncles, and also one of my older cousins back in the countryside. And some of those stories, for some reason, they seemed so exotic to me because I was born in the capital, right, and also dealing with people in a big city. You kind of become desensitized to the countryside way of life. Yeah, having that environment around me, I think, influenced me hugely in terms of sparking in myself or encouraging an appreciation for writing and for stories, and in a very funny, intriguing, different way. That's what I kind of do today.
And when it comes to storytelling, can you share what are the most important parts of a story, especially when you try to transmit a message, not necessarily a story per se?
One of my mentors, someone I consider a mentor, is someone I did a few courses with. Her name is Lisa Cron. She's American. And one of my favorite quotes of her is one that she says, stories is not about telling your story, it's about creating an experience for the listener. So I think when you study your story with that in mind, you kind of move away a little bit from your ego, from your necessity to talk about yourself, and you start putting the listener or the reader in the center of that moment. When you do that, you end up creating an experience for that person, whoever that person is, or whoever that group of people are. So stories can be divided into many different elements. I can mention someone else here who I really admire, Donald Miller. So if you think about stories and Donald Miller way of storytelling, we would come up here with 7 or 8 different elements, right? There is tension, there is problem, hero, mentor, a plan, climatic scene. He makes an analogy with movies, and yeah, and then the villain and a few other elements. But then circling back to your question, I don't want to deviate here too much. I think it comes down to creating an experience for the listener, for the reader. It needs to be relevant to them, right? You might start a story, either be text, either be a post, a book, or a keynote, whatever it is. You might start thinking, wow, what do I want out of this? What do I want to achieve? What do I want them to think or do as a result of this moment? However, it is also highly necessary to think, why is this relevant to them? Because if it's only relevant to me, I think the story loses its meaning. I think it loses its connection to the audience.
Yeah, we always tend to think that telling a story is only about ourselves, telling our story or telling the things that go through. But if we put the hero, our listener or our reader and so on in the center of the scene, they will relate. And in that case, it'll be much more easier for them to understand the message or to even make a purchase or something. And I love the example that you brought there with Donald Miller. I love his work. And one of the most important things that I learned from him is the 30-second elevator pitch way of telling it as a story. And that's powerful, how you go from the identification of the problem to you being the solution for them, and they envision the transformation that you'll get if they will use you as the solution or your service as the solution. And basically your target is thinking about their new state in which they'll be if they apply that, and call to action. And rewinding a bit back to your journey from Brazil to New Zealand, and you mentioned that the longest you stayed after that was Australia. What made you stay that long in Australia?
There wasn't anything planned, just to make it clear. I didn't plan to go to Australia and stay that long. In fact, when I went there for the first time back in 2011, I was just an English student. I couldn't speak English, and that was part of my goal when I decided to leave Brazil, was to go to an English-speaking country to learn the language. For some reason, I picked Australia. As an English student, I didn't have much resources with me, like especially financial resources. So I got there, had no connections, no friends, let alone a job offer, none of that, and couldn't speak English. And I decided to make it work and to have that experience as a learning experience, as a huge learning experience for myself. But yeah, after 1 or 2 years in a country, you end up making friendships and making connections and traveling, experiencing new things. You kind of think, well, why am I gonna go back now? Why would I do that? You end up staying a little longer, making more friends and making more connections, and life becomes more meaningful to you. At some point, you start seeing that place as home. You start feeling at home, and you don't want to come back. I think that was kind of what happened with me. On top of that, there is the visa process. Whoever has gone through an immigration process knows how arduous can be, how complex and difficult and challenging the process can be. So I was living my life, renewing my visa every few months, then every few years. Ended up staying for 5 years at first, then moved to Southeast Asia. The idea back then, back in 2015, was to become a digital nomad. At the time, I was obviously reading Tim Ferriss and Rolf Potts, the Vagabonding book, and a bunch of other authors, and decided to become a digital nomad. I went to Southeast Asia, stayed there for a few months, then back to Brazil, back to Europe a few times. As a Brazilian, I can stay in Europe for 3 months as a tourist. So I used that privilege a few times, a few years in a row. And then after a while, do a combination of different variables, I made another decision, which was back in 2018. I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back to Australia. Life in Brazil, it became easy again. It's not challenging off. I've been to Europe a few times. I was in Southeast Asia, traveled throughout the continent and visited a few countries, which was great. But I think I want to go back to Australia. So that's when I went back to Australia and lived up until 2021. But yeah, that's the brief story of my relationship with the country.
Learning the language that way and basically going out of your comfort zone to go in a foreign country and literally start making connections, trying to make friends, finding a job, being a student, and so on. Those are quite a lot of challenges. There was such moment in your life when you felt like, I want to give up. I want to go back to Brazil. I don't want this life.
I don't think there was a moment where I thought about giving up, because the burden of living in Brazil, having a conventional life, and every time I looked back and, wow, man, I was working really hard, hustling and doing my best, but I couldn't catch up. My bank account was always very low. I was very stressed out always. There is this sense of, as you might know, in Brazil is not a very safe country. So there is that also that plays a role in your mind. So every time in Australia life was tough, I just compare with my life in Brazil, and then all of a sudden life became easier in Australia. But I had an accident. I had a motorbike accident back in 2012 after only being in Australia for a year. And that didn't make me think about going back to Brazil, but it hit me really hard, because at the time, having arrived in Australia with not much money, I had to run against the clock to make friendships, get connections to recommend me to a job, whatever the job was. Back then was construction. Then work really hard to save money to renew my visa, right? So my first visa renewal, I got the necessary amount of money 1 week before the expiry date. I was really running against the clock back then. So renewed for 6 months, then renewed for a year. So when I had that accident, I was like, man, come on, I've been saving money now to renew my visa. I've been struggling. I've been going through really tough times here, not knowing the language, not being able to communicate effectively. There is also this thing, right? And you might have gone through that as well yourself because you don't come from an English speaking country, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So you have your life experiences, your knowledge, your expertise, your skills. But then when you move to a different country and don't speak the language, how would people know that? And we are judgmental beings, right? What? I was doing jobs in Australia and struggling every day with communicating and also being judged by others and being blamed by mistakes that I didn't make, but I couldn't defend myself because I couldn't speak English. So answering your question, I didn't think about giving up, but there were some really challenging times that I went through back in Australia. Having said that, when I had that accident, had to go back to Brazil, bought a last minute flight with Emirates, which at the time was the most expensive airline that you could go with from Australia to Brazil. So yeah, I spent a lot of money on that flight, lost my job in Australia, stayed in Brazil for 3 months to recover because I broke my elbow in my hand in 3 different spots. And then went back to Australia exactly 3 months after that. I wasn't still fully recovered from the accident. My bank account had dropped dramatically in the process. And then there I was again starting life from scratch, from square one more time.
That's quite a roller coaster. And I truly believe these experiences is just something that make us tougher, and knowing that if we went through those bad experiences, if we went through those lows, we are able to overcome anything in life. And after you were back in Australia and you start everything from scratch, when was the first time when you actually start doing what you love?
Well, I can say that I spent a good 4 to almost 5 years doing things that I didn't like to make money to renew my visa and pay the bills. So working construction, also hospitality, cleaning offices, what else? Yeah, I was most of the time. I also worked washing cars in a rental car company. So I was doing odd jobs just to pay the bills and put food on the table and beer in the fridge. You keep up with my visa requirements also, you pay for my studies. Throughout this whole time, my mind was always thinking in the future. I was always setting goals and think about what am I going to do once I can have a very good dominance of the English language. What am I going to do once I'm better connected with different people who work in the fields that I want to work? Right? Nothing wrong with construction or hospitality, but that's not what I wanted to do in life. So yeah, I think it was a good 4 to 5 years doing that. Then, as I mentioned before, I wanted to become a digital nomad. And one of the easier ways that I could do that was by teaching English, becoming an ESL teacher, English as a second language teacher. And that's what I did. So back in 2015, I did a CELTA course, became an English teacher, and that's what allowed me to travel around Southeast Asia and teaching English to students, to teenagers as a volunteer teacher. So, but yeah, it was a good 4 to 5 years of struggle, doing things that I didn't like, to buy time, to save money, to most importantly, learn, to acquire knowledge in a bunch of different areas so that then I could transition to something that I liked.
Yeah, I think there is a huge lesson there because we often tend to avoid doing things that we don't love and go out of our comfort zone to achieve something. And you're the perfect example of resilience. And probably this comes from your time in the army. You're able to go through tough times and doing things that you don't know for so long, for 5 years. It's huge. And just because you have a bigger vision than your present state at that point. You dream of being a digital nomad, you dream of teaching others, you dream of writing and so on. And going from not speaking the language to actually teaching that language to others is a huge step, in my opinion. And all that thanks to the fact that you go through those moments in which you simply work your way, build your income balance, and be able to live a life that you dream of. And when you arrive at that stage of teaching English as a second language in Southeast Asia as a volunteer teacher, what was your next goal moving forward?
Well, to be honest, Gabe, I just wanted to travel the world and teach English. Teaching English gave me great satisfaction because I could see the results on the spot, or at least in a few weeks, in a few months, and I could see students going from doing this job and not being paid well or fairly, or not having many possibilities in life, to having more possibilities, getting better jobs, being recognized, improving their self-esteem in the process. So the more I traveled back then, the more I fed myself with energy and enthusiasm. And the more you travel, the more you learn about life, you learn about different possibilities in life, but you end up learning a lot more about yourself as well. So that was my dream, to be able to teach English in a bunch of different countries and to travel, to have my type of freedom or my idea of freedom and live life. And since you mentioned resilience, and yes, my short time in the army helped me with that. Having lived in Brazil for most of my life also helped with that. But I need to give credit to a few different writers whom I read throughout my life and helped me immensely. One of them is, without a doubt, Ryan Holiday. Don't know if you're familiar with him, but I'm a big fan of Ryan Holiday. Have read most of his books. Ego is the Enemy being one of my favorites, but also The Daily Stoic, and Robert Greene, another writer whom I'm a huge fan of. So yeah, those writers, they instilled in my mind this sense of resilience. And I believe that helped me to overcome most of my obstacles in life. That's not to say I didn't make my share of mistakes. Yes, absolutely. I made so many mistakes that I can't even count. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think resilience is a big word in my life.
Since you mentioned that you did a lot of mistakes, can you name the biggest mistake that you made that actually turned out to be a huge lesson for you and help you achieve something?
Sure, it's not hard to find mistakes in my journey to mention here. I think early in life, I bought a car. I'm not sure if here in Europe you guys have that system, but back in Brazil, you can buy anything in installments. Anything, from a blender to an apartment. Yes.
Same in Europe, and I think almost everywhere in the world.
There you go. So yeah, I bought a car in 60 installments. And in a country where inflation is high and also corruption is very high, you end up paying 3 cars by the end of it, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So yeah, that was a huge mistake. To me, the lesson was never live above your means. Never do something just to impress others if that's gonna make you not achieve your goals in the long term. Back then, I could not see that. It took me years to learn that lesson, years, right? Another big mistake I made in life, and that goes back 20 years, was choosing a course at university just because I wanted to go to university, right? So my first university course was geography. Again, nothing wrong in geography. I made great friends. I had a great time at university, but I never worked with that knowledge. Pretty much never, it was never useful to me because I ended up working in different fields. I ended up leading a different life. And the only reason why I chose that course was because I want to go to university. I think it would have been way smarter to wait 1 or 2 years, go travel the world, go do some volunteer work, go become an intern, right? If you like geography, go become an assistant teacher, an assistant geography teacher or something. Do whatever you want, but test yourself, test the waters, right? Test yourself first, then you can have better evidences to make better decisions instead of just rushing and doing for no reason, just because society tells you that you need to go to university after high school and nobody tells you why. They don't give you any reasons, any plausible reasons, and you just go with the flow. So yeah, those big mistakes, buying a car without having the money to pay for it, and then ending up paying 3 cars, and also doing university course that you didn't really know why you were doing early in life. Those were my biggest mistakes.
Yeah, I definitely can relate. This is something that society push us go to university, then buy a house, have a car, have a family, have kids. And yeah, so it's just the path that a lot of people are taking without, as you mentioned, thinking about it. Is this something that I want to do? Is this something that really helps me in life or with my goals and so on? And most of the time, probably the answer is no. And yeah, and living above our income level, above our present moments is just something that will come back hunting us for so long. But glad that you learn from it and you move forward without repeating those mistakes. And when it comes to avoiding mistakes and learning from the mistakes of others, I want to challenge you to create something for those listening that it's actionable and is some sort of step-by-step process in which you can use your experiences, someone that is resilient, someone that learned from his mistakes. And let's say at some point you might teach your kids or someone else to not do the same things like you did. How you envision that?
Well, let's become a little bit more philosophical now. I think most of the mistakes that I made in my life, Gabe, were due to trying to listen to too many people, letting too many distractions come into my system. The whole anxiety thing, trying to be in too many places at the same time, trying to read too many books without double checking the credentials of the writer or the evidence of that theory or that concept. So I think becoming more selective would be an advice that I could share with someone. Be more selective, right? Try to reflect about why are you listening to so many people. Pick a few people. Why are you trying to do so many things? Is that really productive? Is that really sustainable long term? Do you need to be surrounded by so many people and be popular and try to fit in so many different environments? Maybe not. Maybe not. So those are the mistakes that I made. It really makes your mind overloaded with information. And when your mind is in that state, there is no clarity. And I'm big on clarity these days. I learn my lessons. I make my share of mistakes, as I mentioned before. And that's another thing. Having a clear mind helps you make better decisions over time, almost as in a compound effect, puts you in a better position 6 months down the line, 2 years down the line, 5 years down the line. So I think becoming more selective was huge to me, right? Focusing on fewer things, doing what I was doing back then really well done instead of trying to do too many things at the same time. And that's what kind of took me out of this very confusing, distracted world and put me in a better position to have a better life down the line. So that's the main point if I were to pick one thing.
Yeah, that's powerful. And we literally live in a world where information overload is huge. Like we are bombarded with information from every sources, from social media to our friends, to our family, society, news channels or whatever. And if you listen to everyone and if you follow the advice of every single person out there, you just end up doing nothing, probably trying to do many things and trying to please everyone. And being selective with the information you consume, I think it's one of the best advices that I heard lately. And it's something that I need to apply in my life as well, because this point in time, I do too many things. And this is a great reminder. So thank you so much for that. And going a bit back to your story, after you went through Southeast Asia and teach English as second language, and at some point I know that you arrived in Europe. What made you leave this part of the world where I'm calling from and moving to the old continent?
It was a very personal decision, Gabe. I was back in Adelaide, South Australia, back in August 2021, having a glass of wine and reflecting about my life. I'm an only child, so I don't have siblings. And my parents, they are only getting old. And I wanted to spend more time with them and I wanted to see them more often. Being in Australia wasn't a very strategic move for that goal. So I was thinking to myself back in South Australia where I was living back in 2021 and thought, you know what? If I stay here, I'm not going to be able to see my parents that often. Even if I bring them here to stay here for a few months, it won't be the same because they can't speak the language. It'll be very expensive from a budgeting perspective. It'll be more difficult. So I started putting all those pieces of the puzzle together and very rapidly made the decision to move to a part of the world from where I could have easy access to them. For those of you listening to us, and you heard me mentioning Fortaleza, my hometown, if you have never been to Brazil or never been to the northeast of Brazil, Fortaleza is the closest point between Brazil and Europe. It's a 7-hour flight between Fortaleza and Lisbon here in Portugal, which is very different from a 36-hour flight from Adelaide to Fortaleza. So that was the main driver of that decision, to be very honest. However, on top of that, I always dreamed of living in Europe. I always dreamed of spending some time in Spain, which is a country that I love, or Italy, or even in Portugal. So it wasn't a sacrifice. Just want to make that clear, right? I came here, it was a decision mainly based on my desire to spend more time with my parents. In fact, they came here last year, spent 3 months with me, which was great. Yeah, and I hadn't seen them since 2018. They're already planning to come here this year. I've just moved to a new place in Portugal. Last year, I traveled all over the country, meeting people, visiting different cities and trying different things. And about 2 months ago, I moved to northern Portugal. It's a beautiful city called Vila Real. It translates to Royal Village. It's a beautiful name and a beautiful city, I should say. But yeah, circling back to your question, being closer to my parents was my main driver, but also I love Europe. I love the richness in culture that the continent offers, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's a beautiful gesture. And in the same time, you pack it nicely with your own goals, your own needs. And moving to Portugal, what opportunities open for you? Because I know that currently you're not teaching English anymore. And I would love to hear more about what you're currently doing.
Sure. I need to go a little bit back to Australia again to answer your question. So back in 2020, I was an English teacher, as you just mentioned, but I also had my side business as a private English teacher. It was a side business that was growing very rapidly. So I started hiring all the teachers. At some point, I had about 35 English students at the same time. I had 4 teachers helping me to handle those students. And I wasn't feeling the way I felt before when I started teaching the language. And when my journey teaching the language went on for a few years, it reached a plateau where I was feeling really great. But then back in 2020, I didn't have the same passion. I think I achieved pretty much everything that I wanted to achieve. Not a big deal, but I taught English in 5 different countries. I was a non-native English speaker teaching English in one of the best schools in Sydney, which was great. Having as co-workers and colleagues, highly qualified teachers, amazing people with whom I learned so much on a daily basis, made so much friendships with students, organized so many events, so many trips with the students. I had a great time. But back in 2020, I wasn't feeling the same fire inside of me. And I already had a passion for storytelling. Remember that I mentioned that my father was a writer and that both my parents were school teachers. So yeah, and that I had a love for writing. So in 2020, I met a man called Tony Boomer, who later became a mentor. He's highly considered by many people in Australia the number one communication coach in the country. And I had an invitation to work with him. And there was the moment the turning point that I took a step back and thought, you know what? I had my moment as an English teacher. It lasted for 6 years, but let me go now and explore the avenues in life. Let me go now and put my skills to test in a different area, in an area that I already have an affinity for. I already have an appetite for, if you like. And yeah, started working with him, then moved to Adelaide, was still working for him in Sydney or with him in Sydney remotely. We work with clients in Southeast Asia, Australia. We usually call it APAC, Pacific Islands. And when I made that decision to come to Europe, I wasn't the Savio English teacher. I was already the Savio communication skills coach and slash storytelling coach or story coach. And when I arrived here, I hit the ground running in Portugal. I already had some connections, started going for coffees with people, which is something very common to do here in Portugal. You meet someone interesting on LinkedIn. Next thing you do is to invite them to go for a coffee. Lisbon, it's booming with digital nomads, events, conferences, web summit, lots of startups, incubators, you name it. The city is just booming. And I was in the right place in the right time, connected to the right people. For some reason, I was very lucky in that sense, although I don't believe in luck. But anyways, I digress.
We build our own luck, right?
That's right. That's right. And yeah, I found my own clients. I was still working for the Boomer Group of Tony Boomer back in Australia, but much less intensely, fewer hours. The time zone difference wasn't allowing us to do many projects together anymore. And I got to a point where I had to make a decision and to call it a day. So we finished our working relationship in good terms. We're still good friends. I still talk to him almost on a weekly basis on LinkedIn. He's a great person, has huge importance in my life as a mentor and as someone who made an invitation on a moment where I was losing passion for my previous profession. And then I saw myself in Portugal working on my own as a freelancer or as an independent professional, if you like, and found my first clients, one client here, another client there. And I don't know if you have the same feeling, but I'm assuming you do when you are starting a new project, a new thing, and you have the first paying client, the first person who believes in what you have to offer. It gives you that feeling inside. It's even hard to put into words. So when I found the first one, it felt like a fighter, MMA fighter smelling blood. So I went for the kill. I was crafting, refining my methodology, my consultancy offer. And from that client, that person recommended me another person. I improved my work by getting feedback from the first person, applied in the second person, listened, applied active listening, that is another skill that I made a point of developing for myself. And then active listening, feedback, improvement to the market again, offering, developing relationships on LinkedIn, but also offline, going for coffees again. And then the whole system was working. That's not to say I'm booked out all year or my bank account is with millions and millions of dollars. That's not true. But I'm feeling very comfortable at this stage in my life, having autonomy and freedom, living in a beautiful country, in a beautiful city, having a handful of clients, but good clients, doing some really consistent work with them and being recommended to other clients almost on a weekly basis. And that's the full picture to answer your question.
I think you touch on some really important points there, especially when it comes to luck, quote unquote. Because, yeah, true, we build our own luck. There's not such thing like something will just happen to us by mistake that will change our life to the better. We build it, and you build it through building relationships. And those are huge. And it's probably one of the most overlooked way to build a business, build a name for yourself, get clients, and so on. Because at the end of the day, we are humans. And if we manage to build powerful connection with others, and of course, we need to be also good at what we do, but also we can improve us. You're the perfect example. You mentioned that. You get that client, you ask for feedback, and you revise your offer, you revise your methodology and so on in order to improve it. You don't just go blindly doing the same thing again and again without actually trying to improve what you do. And I think all of these are really, really important lessons for anyone listening, anyone into freelancing that wants to find clients, that want to actually try to get as much as possible when it comes to learning, being paid for, providing value to their clients, is to improve. Try, ask for feedback, improve, and so on. And speaking of this, can you please tell us where you can find you? You mentioned LinkedIn, and where else those interested can find you to work with you if they want.
Sure, yeah, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So Savio Meireles, you can easily find me there. My website goes with the same name, saviomeireles.com. And my email, if someone wants to reach out via email, it's let's talk at saviomeireles.com. So I'm easily reachable through those three different mediums.
Awesome. I will put also the links in the show notes. And to wrap things up, I want you to create a challenge for our listeners. The 24-hour challenge in which you will have a significant boost into their way of finding clients through building relationships and collaborations. What is one thing they can do in less than 24 hours in order to find maybe their first client or the next client and so on?
Sure. That's a great question. You're helping me here because somebody asked me that question yesterday, a client. So I had to think about it and to design or write down a strategy for the client. So I got that really fresh in my mind.
That's great to hear.
But yeah, it's what I call a fast track strategy. You look at your market, you look at your clients or potential clients, and you're trying to find things that they are doing wrong. You can find that very easily just by looking at their website, just by looking at their social media profiles, the way they are. In my case, it's communication, storytelling for brands. So I look at them, websites, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever you can kind of research about them, and you spot mistakes. Then you list those mistakes, you draft an email very carefully, and you approach them. It doesn't have to be an email. It can be even in person. It can be through LinkedIn. It can be through the best medium that you can get to the client. And you pretty much send them a very well-informed piece of content, helping them to solve those mistakes. The thing is, there is a very fine line between the short-term instant gratification mentality and the more long-term patient, more mature mentality. Sometimes there is a fine line. And I know sales is important. I really admire sales professionals, and I wear a sales person hat sometimes, but I also like to test what you said, the human connection. And I do that all the time, right? I provide value to someone without asking anything in return. Sometimes I can even tell the person that is expecting a call to action, and there is no call to action. So I'm providing value to the point that the person wasn't even thinking about those answers. The person, sometimes they know they're making mistakes for some reason, lack of time, lack of bandwidth. They can't solve those mistakes, but sometimes they don't even know they're making those mistakes. And then somebody coming out of the blue, somebody's not out of the blue. Sometimes I have already connected them on LinkedIn and added value to them and connected, made comments, received comments in my content. But then one day, there is an email from Savio. pointing out something in a very non-offensive way and offering some suggestions, some answers, but making a point of saying those suggestions are validated because I've done that with my clients and it worked. And I think that might be highly beneficial to you. And no call to action. You'd be surprised how many recommendations it would be born out of those genuine interactions. Even if the person doesn't buy anything from you, and that's totally fine. That's totally fine. But the next time somebody talks to that person about communication skills, storytelling, brand storytelling, somebody to talk to analyze my communication, man, I think my name is going to pop up first in their minds.
That's for sure. And that's a powerful way to help others. And that's powerful. I think you put this challenge perfectly out there, and anyone that is listening can apply this in less than 24 hours, because you just, as Savio said, go to their online presence and see, depending on your expertise, maybe you're a graphic designer, maybe you're a web designer, a copywriter, wherever, and you can, based on your expertise, spot some improvements or some solutions to possible problems your prospects might have. And you don't have to sell them. Help them, and the good things will turn back to you.
I think another thing you can combine with that, I'm a huge fan of the VOC concept, right? Voice of the customer. I'm also a copywriter. So I'm always trying to think how people are thinking. I'm always trying to move a little bit away from my own ego and try to see from the perspective of others. So if you do that, if you approach 5 to 10 people in the next 24 hours, provide value to them by offering answers to their problems, whatever they say, copy and paste and put on a folder called VOC. Put it on a board. We usually, people use Miro or InVision or Canva, or whatever tool you use. Create a board called VOC, Voice of the Customer. Once you receive those comments back to you, copy and paste and put in there. Next thing, 2 weeks later, you have a massive amount of information that you can use to craft your message. There you go.
That's a powerful tip, really powerful. And at the same time, some of those reply messages can be even a short testimonial for you, because you just helped someone, and maybe that thing that helped means a lot to them, and they kind of possibly make a lot of money out of your solution. So it turned out to be probably a testimonial as well. Yeah, that's a powerful tip. Personally, I never heard before. So yeah, your communications with expertise and copywriting, so it's strongly visible there. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much for jumping into the call today with me. So happy to have you in the show and to have this chat with you. Definitely made my day. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your words. I'm a huge fan of your work. I've mentioned that before. And I was just going through one of your newsletters. I'm a subscriber of your newsletter. I was like, man, how can this guy pack so much knowledge, so much content, valuable content inside of one newsletter? That's unbelievable.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
The respect is mutual here, okay? And let's keep in touch. And whenever you want to have another conversation, just hit me up for another 7 a.m. call before my coffee.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Make sure to check the show notes where you'll find direct links to the tools and resources mentioned in this episode, and much more. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast station to not miss when we drop the next one. We have lots of exciting guests and surprises for you coming up. This is your host, Gabe Marushka, with the Nomad Solopreneur Show. Until next week, pura vida!